Especially in a busy lay life, it can be quite difficult to distance oneself from sensuality. It's everywhere. You can get whatever you wish at the click of a button, pretty much nowadays. And while we intellectually, oftentimes at least, understand that it is good for us to renounce sensuality, the heart, as the Buddha sometimes said in the suttas, does not leap out to it. One way to properly ingrain the message is the practice of the Uposatha. And in doing so, we, at least once in a while, practice like monks and nuns, and may make a breakthrough to the Dhamma like that. But how to practice the Uposatha rightly? After all, the rules seem to be quite old, and oftentimes they are kind of outdated, maybe. Well, let's find out today. Well, first of all, the at least temporary abstinence from certain kinds of pleasures are not anything new or anything that is super special to the Buddha Dhamma or anything like that. There are lots of modern examples in various different religions. There's fasting in Islam, as an example. There's fasting in Christianity. There's probably some equivalent in the Catholic religion. I do not know that, though. But when it comes to eating, many of the religions do offer some kind of at least temporary abstinence practice or something like that. And in modern times, it is also not too rare that people try something akin to intermittent fasting, restricting the eating to a certain time of the day, and the rest of the time you do not eat anything, which is also a type of at least temporary renunciation, let's put it like that, of the pleasure that comes with eating tasty foods. And most of the time, at least, people report all kinds of health benefits when it comes to fasting. They often state that at least the first and the second, or maybe even the third day after starting the fast, they report increased mental clarity. Overall, at least as I understand it, the current research, it seems to indicate that health greatly benefits from at least temporary abstinence, and in general from eating maybe a bit less or exactly what you need. However, the problem with just restricting your food intake is that your overall craving usually just finds another target. It shifts to something else once your animal mind registers that there's no food coming in. It looks for a different kind of pleasure, I would say. However, also in modern times, people came up with what is nowadays called an instant gratification detox. And this is a much closer approximation when it comes to the actual practice of the Uposatha. You can still indulge in all kinds of things, but at least when it comes to instant gratification, there is a limit that you put on it. Yet, you can still indulge in all kinds of other things, like indulging in work, in debates online, and all such things. There's still potentially craving involved, and that craving can very well shift to things like work, distraction, socializing, building relationships, or whatever. It's a much better and much healthier kind of craving when it comes to worldly metrics. But when it comes to the path, this kind of craving is still craving and has to be overcome. So yeah, what would be the solution to that? One could say that you want to achieve a state of non-distraction. And many modern people also try to achieve such a state, not being constantly on the phone or something like that. But most of the rules that we set for ourselves leave way too much wiggle room. It is still possible to do this kind of abstinence practice in very wrong ways, even though it becomes much, much harder the more refined your rule set gets. You can still delight in work, delight in talk, delight in sleep, delight in the food that you have while you are fasting, and you can delight in debating, you can delight in gaining praise and fame, and all kinds of other things. So even if you observe the Uposatha, there are still many outlets for your cravings that still exist. But it's a much better state than before. So anyway, now that we know a few examples when it comes to the Uposatha, we can have a look at the 8 precepts that you are observing when you are actually trying to observe the Uposatha. And in essence, you try to emulate the Arahants, according to the suttas. And what you essentially do is you stick to the rule of not killing, not stealing, not engaging in any kind of sexual behavior, telling no lies, taking no drugs that are the source of heedlessness, and you do not eat after midday. Also, and this is very important, you do not allow for any sensual distractions, for any craving-related distractions. In the suttas, it is usually phrased as abstaining from shows and scented garlands and nice sandalwood or something like that. And in addition to that, you also abstain from high and luxurious beds. So in essence, you're basically sleeping either on a small bed, on the couch maybe, on the floor, on a straw mat, or something like that. In essence, you also try to remove the craving from sleeping and your comfy bed. And the goal is obviously, at least I find it obvious, to eliminate the major causes of sensuality or the major triggers. In essence, I mean, it's sensuality because of your intentions and not because of the world around you. But you want to seclude yourself, at least physically, as much as possible from all those things that typically trigger your craving-related behavior. Yeah. And in the suttas, it is stated as follows. Then many Sakyan lay followers, it being the Uposatha day, went to the Blessed One. On arrival, having bowed down to him, they sat down on one side. And as they were sitting there, the Blessed One said to them, Sakyans, do you observe the 8-factored Uposatha? They pretty much responded, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And the Buddha responded, it's no gain for you, Sakyans. It's ill-gotten that in this life, so endangered by grief, in this life, so endangered by death, you only sometimes observe the 8-factored Uposatha, and sometimes you don't. Now, Sakyans, there is a case where a disciple of mine spending 10 years practicing as I have instructed would live sensitive to unalloyed bliss of 100 years, 100 centuries, 100 millennia, and he would be a once-returner, a non-returner, or at the very least a stream winner. Let alone half a month. There is a case where a disciple of mine spending 10 days and nights, 9 days and nights, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 day and night. One single day and night practicing as I have instructed. And he would live sensitive to the unalloyed bliss of 100 years, 100 centuries, or 100 millennia. And he would be a once-returner, a non-returner, or at the very least a stream winner. And this is from Anguttara Nikaya number 10.46. And what the Buddha essentially said there is that if someone were to practice rightly, how the Buddha instructed, even for the time, for just a single day and night, which is basically the Uposatha, then you have a chance at least to become a stream winner, to become one who understands the Dhamma at least. And essentially, we try to overcome the fetters, pretty much. And especially what we do for that, we first have to rob the process of ignorance, the process of that keeps us in samsara, of its immediate fuels. And for the most people, that would mean that we have to rein in and restrain our lustful behaviors. And the suttas are very clear on how it feels when you abandon lust, as an example. The Buddha usually gave 5 different similes for the 5 different hindrances that you can overcome. And in the case of lust, the Buddha said in Majjhima Nikaya number 39, and in many other suttas, by the way, suppose a man were to take a loan and undertake a business, and his business were to succeed so that he could repay all the money of the old loan, and there would remain enough extra to maintain a wife. Then, on considering this, he would be glad and full of joy. So as you can see, the Buddha compared sensuality and the training that removes you from sensuality with paying back a big debt. So what he essentially says is that all the sensual enjoyment that we're usually engaging in is like taking up debt. We are enjoying something, but we have to pay it back later. Whatever we experience after that great joy, that great sensual joy that we had before, will fade in comparison. So we kind of have to deal with the impermanence. And this is also the reason why we feel quite bad when we detox from sensuality and instant gratification, when we practice such a modern style of abstinence. And in that case, we are starting to pay back our sensual debt. So we do not feel bad because we are detoxing. We feel bad because of the prior engagement with sensuality. We have accumulated a lot of debt over a very long period of time, and as such, we have to pay back a lot. There's a lot of interest that has accumulated over time, and now we feel very bad when we no longer have access to all the things that we usually use to cope. And this is kind of the point. We are paying back debts usually by taking up new debts to pay back the old one, etc. And this is not a very good or healthy way to go about it if you know anything about finances. And if you experience some kind of great joy, some kind of great sensual joy, then everything is worse in comparison compared to that joy before. And when you do that for a very long time, then all the small pleasures will pretty much fade from your life. and there's nothing that you can enjoy anymore. And when you indulge, you also take up that debt the very moment. It's due to the prior cultivation of addiction and not due to the restraint. And it's very important to undergo this reframing of your mind, because many people are under the assumption that it is a restraint that is to blame. The pain of restraint is actually the delayed pain of the addictions that we have cultivated before. And the same is very obvious in the case of a drug addict. And there's no real difference between a person who enjoys taking drugs versus a person who just enjoys any kind of sensual distractions like tasty food or sexuality or anything like that. The difference is just that on a worldly level, some kinds of addictive behaviors have more gross side effects or more gross immediate effects, like addiction. And sensuality overall is just the most general kind of addiction of them all. It is a mother of addictions. It is an addiction to the engagement with the senses in any way that is there to generate pleasure. That is essentially what sensuality is. And in the case of a drug addict, they take their drug of choice again and again and again. And after a while, they cannot enjoy anything anymore except for their drug. Everything else fades in comparison. And now, if they would stop to take their drug because they have no longer any access to it, then they have to pay back the debt and they feel miserable. In some cases, when you have been severely addicted to any kind of heavy drug, then it can take years on end until you have an honest feeling of joy again, simply because you have so much debt that you have to pay back. Anyway, how to practice the Uposatha rightly? We can, for example, start analyzing our typical day by the amount of time we spend with certain things. And if we just do that, we very likely come to the conclusion that we spend about 8 hours each day just sleeping. And as you might imagine, there's a rule for that, that makes sleep less inviting and less sensual. Then we have about 8 hours of work. Well, that is usually good to go, because work in itself is not very sensual unless you are a workaholic. But in that case, you know that you probably should also restrain your work. And then we have about 8 hours of free time. So 1/3 of a day is pretty much what we have at our hands to spend however we wish. And apart from that 8 hours, is usually 2 hours of eating or something like that, or eating related things like cooking. And if you restrict that too, and you cannot distract yourself or enjoy yourself with eating, then you still have maybe 6 hours or something like that left each day to do whatever you wish. And in this case, if you observe the 8 precepts, then you have to be very strict about what you do. And there are certain differences when it comes to the rules. As an example, the 5 precepts and the 8 ones are not necessarily completely the same. However, they govern the mandatory distractions like eating and sleeping and the optional ones. And the biggest chunk, the biggest new rule would be that no sexuality and no instant gratification are allowed. And this leaves us with basically nothing but work and practice that we can do if we do it rightly. It is still not perfect by any means, because a good kind of practice always involves intentionality and checking what kind of actions are wholesome and what kind of actions are unwholesome. But it is already a quite good approximation of the practice, because at least initially, you do not have the replacements ready that you could indulge in. At least initially, it is a very restrained, heavy practice, where you no longer have access to everything that you would love to have. And now you have to experience the pain of withdrawal, the pain of prior addiction. And in such a state, you are doing something very wholesome, and it would be very beneficial for you. And a typical example day could be comparable with a retreat schedule. You do the minimum of amount of work that is necessary to maintain the monastery and to maintain the monks. As an example, if you stay at a monastery as a visitor, you are typically taking care of the monks and cooking for them, and maybe do some cleaning, maybe some wood chopping or something like that. Things that monks are not allowed to do, like breaking the soil to dig some hole for a new toilet or something like that. And then you spend some time eating and drinking before midday. There's typically some kind of calendar hanging around, and you try to stick to that. And apart from that, there's not much you can do that would be allowable according to the 8 precepts. You maybe spend some time sitting, you spend some time walking, and you spend some time in other meditative postures, maybe drinking a tea from time to time, and maybe listening to a Dhamma talk or having Dhamma discussions or something like that. But apart from that, you should even restrict your speaking as much as possible. You it would be very beneficial, at least, to speak as little as possible, I would say. And all those things can be done to avoid boredom, I would say. A discussion and all the other things. And the intention of those practices, or there should be an accompanying intention that you should not act out of boredom. You should not just do walking meditation or sitting meditation just to not be bored, or browse endless books about Dhamma, or listen to one Dhamma talk after another. This is not the idea. You should limit your sensuality. And limiting sensuality, even if the 8 precepts only give you very rough outlines of that, should also include looking for your intentionality. You have to understand when you act out of greed, hatred, and delusion, or in this case, mainly when you act out of lust. Lust is the biggest hindrance for most people out there nowadays, I would say. And most of the time in the suttas, the Buddha talked about jhana and the practice of non-lust. And only in some cases, the Buddha talked about the practice of non-hatred or the Brahmaviharas. They are still very important, and there are people who are prone to hateful behavior, harmful self-criticism, criticism concerning others, people who are very angry at other people, road raging or something like that. For them, the practice of the Brahmaviharas would be very beneficial. But overall, most people are more prone to lust. And if you rightly try to observe the Uposatha, it will be extremely difficult if you are a beginner. You can make it more gradual if you wish and move towards it, like only sticking to a subset of those rules or only doing it once every month or something like that. But still, the overall idea is that you emulate the lifestyle of an arahant pretty much and try to make your life as much as the life of an arahant as possible. And it is being like a monk or living like a monk once a week or once a fortnight or once a month or whatever interval you choose. You can just go by the official Uposatha, like a new moon, half moon, full moon cycle, if you wish. But any kind of restraint kind of has the same benefits. This really forces you to periodically look at the depth, the essential depth that you have accumulated over time, and you are forced to go through that withdrawal. And over time, your mind will likely notice that it might not be worth it to cultivate some addiction again and again and again, only to pay it back 14 days later or something like that. And things can never get too bad like that if you have that reminder in place that sensuality is actually quite painful and that the addictions that you cultivate has to be paid back at some point. In a sense, you do force yourself to experience your debt regularly. And this is a constant reminder of the impermanence of pleasures, the impermanence of your body. It's a constant reminder of the practice. Simply because you cannot really do anything but practice if you correctly observe the Uposatha. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Let us now come to the most important points. First of all, the Buddha did praise the Uposatha quite a lot, but the rules can seem outdated nowadays, and there's a lot of wiggle room, and you can find activities nowadays that have not been explicitly mentioned. The Buddha never said anything about watching TV or anything, but he talked about not watching shows or theater plays or anything like that, and I do not think it's too far-fetched to transfer that rule to modern times and make out of that you should avoid any kind of distraction. And the modern environment has a lot of those loopholes, and we have to constantly remind ourselves that we should not break them. Again, those rules and observances are there to help us and not to restrict or limit us. But essentially, we try to live like monks for one day and one night. And you try to practice non-sensuality. And this would be the initial practice, at least, that leads up to jhana. Because jhana is the freedom from sensuality. It's a freedom from lust, one could say. It's non-lust, if you phrase it in a negative way. And observing the Uposatha rightly is very difficult for beginners, but it is of great fruit and great benefit. And if you do it rightly, you can overcome the upadana of sensuality for long enough to make a breakthrough to the Dhamma, which would be for your benefit and the benefit of others for a very long time. But anyway, this should be enough for today. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to post them in the comments below. But until then, I wish you a pleasant day and goodbye.